Thank you. I'm not used to applause, so thank you very much. So I just want to run through the process quickly. And if you do not have a brochure, we have several copies. Chad produced a nice, slick brochure to try to get the word out about this. So I was in a meeting just this afternoon with the president and the provost, and I, for maybe bad idea, but I said, you know, our goal is going to be to fill Worsham Cinema on October 30th. So I'm going to try to do it. So it's going to be up to you all to bring your friends, family, professors, people you meet on the street into Worsham Cinema, because the whole spirit of this is not only to give you graduate students and postdocs practice presenting to a public audience, which you may not get very much practice at normally in your programs, but it's also just to highlight the fascinating research that goes on here at the university that for the most part, most of the time, stays behind closed walls. And, you know, your research may be well known within your own program, and it may be known nationally outside the university, but it may not be very well known here on campus. So the idea of this is to heighten the awareness of all this research that's going on. So I encourage you to, even though you're here tonight because you're going to want to present or compete, so you might not be inclined to get other competitors into the arena, but I encourage you to do that if you can, to also encourage your peers and friends in other disciplines maybe to consider participating in this. It's a little bit early in the application process. I think it closes on the 14th. But we have, how many do we have, Chad, approximately?
I think we're in the 30s now.
Okay, so it's gone up a little bit since I looked at it last. When I did look at it, there were not very many in the showcase, the two showcases. Most of the applications so far have been in the 3MT. So let me run through the process real quick for you. And you can't see this, I know, bad slide example. This is actually some wording from the pamphlet, and it's on the website as well. So it's a public graduate and postdoc research showcase with a 3MT competition. So traditionally, for the last 6 years, we've had the 3MT, which is mainly for graduate students nearing the end of their research project. So there hasn't been a good mechanism for graduate students to participate in this early in their project. And so that's what we're really, that's one of the reasons that we're scaling this up and expanding it, to try to give graduate students who are early in the program a chance to begin practicing, because we think that's crucial. You can't, it's hard to wait until the end and then try to do this, although we have had plenty of successes at that. But if you have a chance to practice a few times, then you might be more competitive if you do enter the 3MT then. So we have the Graduate Student Research Showcase, primarily for master's and doctoral students who are early in the research process, but also for anyone at any stage, any grad student at any stage of the research process, who may not be quite ready to compete in that stressful 3MT environment where you don't have any note card and you have to have one slide and you have to go to about 2 minutes and 50 seconds. So the research showcase then allows a little more freedom. You can use one note card if you'd like. A slide is optional, though as you'll see tonight, we do encourage a graphic. And you don't have to go the full 2 minutes and 50 seconds or three minutes. You can go a minute, 2 minutes, whatever you'd like to try. Okay. So there's that. There's the postdoc showcase, which is, it follows the 3MT rules basically. So they do not have the option not to have a slide. They have to have a slide. They have to go to about 3 minutes. So it's using the traditional 3MT rules. It's just that postdocs cannot compete in the global 3MT or the regional 3MT, so we gave them their own track. Okay? And then the 3MT competition. So the preliminaries we have divided by disciplinary division, and there was a certain amount of randomness to the way we divided some of them, but we think on the whole it's pretty solid, so that there'll be 4 concurrent preliminary rounds, and those are going to be video recorded and viewed by an evaluation committee. And you'll get rubric feedback. It may not be narrative, it may just be a checklist, depending on how many we have to evaluate. But the idea is to give you your video file and give you the rubric feedback, and then the selection committee also makes the decision about who advances using basically the 3MT criteria. We haven't yet established a different set of criteria for the showcases, or the grad student showcase. But we have all of these preliminary rounds in auditoriums. We know that they're going to be too large a space for preliminaries, but we wanted to simulate what the final might be like in a large space. So they're in the SAY auditorium in Ag, Karpf auditorium, which is in Pavilion A in the Med Center, and Taylor Education auditorium and Taylor Ed building, and then upstairs here in the auditorium. That auditorium upstairs is actually the smallest of those. So the idea then is that 3 graduate student showcase presenters will advance from each division to the finals. 3 3MT presenters will advance, and then up to 6 postdocs across all the divisions can advance, so that ultimately it'll total, if it all works out, we have enough participation, around 30 participants in the final. In the 3 different tracks total. Okay. This is idealized. We hope it'll all work out. We hope we'll have the participation numbers. Yes. So, if you have not been in Worsham Cinema, most of you have, but it's a spectacular space. You can see a little bit of it there. That's from our TA orientation, holds 560 or so. It has a vibe to it that's, I think, not usually felt here at the university or something. If you're more at ease, actually, I have always been more at ease down there in Worsham Cinema than any other place, any large space on campus. It's just the way it's designed. I don't know how to explain it, but I think you make it to the finals, you'll enjoy being in this space. And the acoustics in there are wonderful too. Okay, so that's Tuesday, October 30th, beginning at 4:30, last a couple of hours, and our plan is to have a networking reception afterwards around the social staircase there, the social stairs there in the student center. And depending on the timing and how long it takes the judges to determine the winners and so forth, whether we have to tally the people's choice or whether we're going to do that using some sort of online mechanism. We're still working that out. We may make the announcements of the winners out on the social staircase rather than in Worsham Cinema, mainly because there's a large contingency of sorority members having a meeting in Worsham Cinema at about 7 o'clock that night. So I'm going to run through some slides that just maybe will remind you of some things. Maybe you'll also learn some things that you haven't thought about before. And then probably there's going to be some overlap with Cheyenne, who will be the main presenter tonight. But I'm going to sort of set the tone based on my own observations of attending regional 3MTs and also being involved in the 3MT here for the past 6 years. Just some tips that I have actually, I would call it, I've distilled these tips down to about 6 or so that I'm sure will show up again in Cheyenne's presentation. But I do want you to think about distilling, because what you end up with is something very spirited, right, for one thing. And so it's a great skill to be able to distill, and you do that if you're a TA and you're a primary instructor or a lab instructor or a recitation leader. You should be doing a lot of distillation of information and getting them to understand it in a way that they didn't before. And that's essentially what you're doing with the 3MT. You're taking very complex information and making it understandable, not dumbing it down, but making it understandable to a novice audience, which is very, very challenging. And not just understandable, but also memorable. And you're telling it in such a way that it can be visualized, and you're using your graphics to help you with that, but also you're having to use language that does, it helps the listener create the visualization also. So, and as I said, you're not dumbing down, you're distilling, and what distilling does is places the focus on the meaning rather than the process. Because as graduate students, you are always enmeshed in the process of what you're doing. And with this, you've got to leave the process behind mostly. And you can bring a little bit of it in, but mostly you're leaving it behind and focusing on the meaning of what you're working on. So, presenting your research to novice audiences to help them learn, I'm putting it this way because how many of you are TAs or plan to be future faculty? No? Okay, that's all right. No matter what you're going to do, inside or outside the academy, you're going to have to condense complex information and make a case. There's going to be many, many times in whatever career you're in that you're going to be doing that. So here are just some basics to help you do that. Make the human connection. And Cheyenne will talk more about this, but you are creating a hook right away, if possible, for your audience to grab their attention and hold it. Okay? You're building a case for why your research matters. You're minimizing and, if possible, even eliminating jargon. And sometimes it's hard for you, who is in the specialization area, to even identify jargon. So it's probably good to practice your talk along the way as you're developing it with friends outside your discipline, family members. We can talk more about that too tonight. Use narrative cues so that it's easy for the listener and the viewer to follow, so that they don't have to work too hard to reconstruct the line of the logic of the story. Use images to support and concretize the central findings or the assertions. And then, really, this is very difficult, I think, be conversational and expressive. If you look at very many of the sample 3MTs from other universities that are online, and you can find a bunch, you'll see that many of them are very, very expressive. And Hannah has mastered the art of being expressive because she was a theater major, right? Or a theater minor. No? You were, I just assumed you were, I guess.
Most people did.
Yeah, okay. Well, and being expressive, depending on your topic, being able to smile while you're talking. It's not always easy. It takes a lot of practice sometimes. So you're doing all these things to help the audience learn. That is really your ultimate goal here. You are trying to teach them something, so I do encourage you to put into practice what you've been taught if you're a TA or if you've attended SILT workshops and so on. These are transferable kinds of skills. So I'm going to run through some, since we have a lot of scientists in here and we're all in graduate education and we value empirical evidence. Here's some evidence. How can we help people learn? What is instruction? Instruction is manipulating what the learner experiences with the intention to cause learning. This is from Richard. The next several slides are from Richard Mayer, who's at the University of California, Santa Barbara, in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. And he's an expert on creating slides, effective slides, and illustrating textbooks also that have very complicated material in them. So he distinguishes between instruction and then multimedia instruction, which is basically what you're doing with the 3MT. Multimedia instruction is instruction that uses words and pictures. So he's done a lot of research in this area. So he says he found that people learn better from words and pictures, the dark bars here, than from words alone. I mean, we would expect that. But it's true really only if the pictures clearly support the words. And that's not always the case. I'm sure you've seen many illustrations that really cause more confusion or are a distraction rather than help. So, people learn more deeply when cues are added that highlight the main ideas and organization of the material. We know that, but we sometimes forget it when we're working on a narrative. People learn more deeply from animation and narration than from animation, narration, and on-screen text. Think about that. What's implied here is that you don't need very much text on your slide. That really you need to emphasize the graphics on the slide and de-emphasize the words. You do use words, use them very judiciously and deliberately, and usually very close to what they're describing on the slide, not very far away from it. People learn more deeply when corresponding printed words and graphics are placed near rather than far from each other. It's just what I was saying on the screen. We can look at some examples later if we have time. Personalization principles. People learn more deeply when words are in conversational style rather than formal style. And this is just an example that if you're talking about, for example, anatomy, it's more effective in this kind of environment to talk about your diaphragm, your lungs, your nose and mouth, rather than the diaphragm, the lungs, and so forth. And the new principle that he claims is emerging in research is this emotional design principle. People learn better when on-screen characters display appealing colors, shapes, and human-like facial expressions. I don't know if you buy into this or not, but he's saying that this is much, much more effective than that. Again, it's the human connection coming into play. This is the curse of knowledge is something that we're all plagued with if we're in graduate school. Okay? It's when you know something so well, it's difficult to imagine what it's like not to know it. And so you do have to step outside of your expertise when you're working on your script or your narrative for this, and you're coming up with your language and your graphics. So find the core ideas, stick to them, and Cheyenne's going to talk some about this. I'm going to talk more about it on Thursday night as well. Engage your listener in the story, then introduce complexity gradually. Sort of what a newspaper writer does, giving all the main important ideas first, and then gradually introducing the complexity, so that if a reader tunes out after reading the first few paragraphs, at least all the major information's there in the mind. You don't want your listener to tune out on this, but principle's the same, is that you give sort of the core principles up front, and then then the scaffolding's there to allow for some jargon if you need to use it, because it could be understood perhaps. You have a question?
No.
Avoid the abstract, use examples, anecdotes, analogies to help appeal to the sense. And then build a story, and by that really we mean, again, it's connecting to the human condition in some way, which is plagued by all kinds of things, and that can be sort of understood in terms of these things: surprising, exciting, difficult, upsetting, mysterious, and so forth. If you can turn your research that you're not used to thinking about in this way at all into a mystery that you had to solve, and what are those milestones along the way, I guess, that you had to come to and discover and overcome and so forth. It's a struggle that you're telling, and somehow you've surmounted this, and you're coming to a conclusion. You tell it that way. So appeal to logic and emotion both. Don't be afraid to show your passion or to get personal, which is what you're not used to doing, probably, very much in your graduate programs. And that's it for my part. So the same team basically will be here with a few additions on Thursday night. And both workshops are going to be interactive as best we can. Thursday night might be a little more interactive in the sense that you're actually going to be working through and distilling a little bit of your own project in a few minutes, and then sort of sharing some of that out. I'm right about that, right, Chad? Is that sort of the plan? So thank you all. I'll turn it over to Cheyenne.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Answer. Good evening, everyone. Okay, so my name is Cheyenne Moradi, and I'm a PhD student at the Cardiovascular Research Center. And as I was walking to get to here, I was thinking about how I can talk about what's my relevance to hold this without sounding a little braggy. So I was like, okay, I'm just saying that I'm not trying to brag. So I was fortunate enough to win the first place during the master's competition back in 2014. Then I was able to win a third place. Then at the PhD, I was able to win a first place. And then I went to the regional. I was able to be a finalist at the regional, and that was supplemented with 2 People's Choice Award as well. So the reason that I'm sharing this information is that I think what I've tried to have here is basically all the points and tricks that I think help me to accomplish these different steps. And these are all based on experiences that I had, rather than talking about some explanation that you read off the website. So with that, I'd like to ask you one question before delving into the material. And the first question is that how many, I had a terrible day, I had a very long day. How many of you had a really, really long and bad day like me? Raise your hand. Okay, so about around half the people around here. And what time is it? It's around 6. So by 4:30 in the afternoon, you will have the actual 3-minute thesis competition. And all these people, the people who are sitting around here, will be a part of your audience. So remember that many of us will have a bad day. We will be consumed by all the stuff that will happen at the day. So if you will be able to produce that enthusiasm, if you'll be able to try to talk loud, if you'll be able to try to grasp that attention, that's something that will make a difference, and you will get something out of your audience. So with that, I'll get into the plans and points that I will be talking about tonight. So first, I'll get into a little bit of details about the very first dilemma or the very first fear when it comes to public speaking, and that's the podium panic, the panic that you get going up there and see all the people sitting right over there. And then after that, I'll try to discuss a little bit of these no-nos that you shouldn't do when you're doing a presentation or a public speaking. And after that, I think there are 5 rules that I personally believe in them that makes a killer presentation, stops that boring presentation, and I'll try to get into the details of that as well. So, if you want to talk about the different styles of presentation, I'm a walker, sorry, I'll just go unblock the screen. So the very first one is that, okay, there's a presentation, you are trying to describe your research and the rationale behind that, why you are doing it, why it should make sense. What's the first step, what's the second step, what's the third step. So that's one part, that one category of presentations. The other category is business presentation. Straight to the point, not so many details, just profit, whether you get something out of it for the people who is sitting in front of you or not. And then the other 2 points that somehow combine these 2 types of presentation with each other is the communications skill, how you deliver your message, how you try to convey your message and grasp that attention from the person who you're presenting to. And finally, the overall scheme of what you're doing in the public or on the stage or in that room that you're doing the presentation. So the whole public speaking matter of the point. So, if you want to get into the details of every one of these, there's one common question. What is a good presentation? And that is a question that I want you to think about. And let's see, just throw out an idea. What do you think is a good presentation? Like this one that was in The Great Dictator, Charlie Chaplin's movie. A very fascinating and very powerful speech in that. So if you want to think about a presentation that you think is powerful, what do you think it is?
Make it very interesting.
Interesting. So that's one thing. Having it interesting. Any other ideas?
Short.
Short. That's a good one. You can do that when you're doing an hour, doing a seminar. So. But yeah, if in case of 3-minute thesis, definitely short is really good. So interesting, short. What else?
Funny.
Funny. That's a great point. So you need to add that humor flavor a little bit because it makes it interesting, as was brought up earlier. There's like 25 of us here. I look at like 3. Come on. We need to think.
Memorable.
Memorable. That's great. And the reason these questions that I'm asking is because, as I mentioned, each one of you will be the audience of the person next to you. So if you remember that what you think that the person next to you is sitting thinks is interesting for that presentation, those are the things that most of the audience will have in mind when they think about your presentation. So it should be interesting, it should be fun, it should be short. But personally, one of the things that I think is really matter is that it connects very well. Different points are brought up into conversations, in the presentations. So if you are creative enough to be able to connect these different points, make a logical sense, make a good flow of information, you'll get to a point that the audience will understand you, will relate to you, and will enjoy your presentation because they are not going out of the room and be like, what was that? What was that figure? What was those explanations? What were those big words? I didn't get anything out of that conversation or that presentation. So if you are making sense of different steps of your presentation, you'll get to a point that you will have a memorable conversation, a presentation. So, in order to have one of those memorable presentations, the first thing that usually happens to each presenter is that when you approach that podium, when you go up the stage, when you see all the seats filled with people over there, so you get that panic. It's called podium panic. People have different ways of dealing with it. Imagine your audience is nude, look at the farthest point at the end of the room, things like that. So these are different approaches for overcoming your podium panic, but I don't really believe in any of them. So when you want to do the presentation, of course, we're all like, let's panic, we're panicking. But the point is just fighting that panic. How we're going to fight that panic are a bunch of simple rules. So the very first one, which I think is the majority of importance in developing your presentation, is the planning. So you need to figure out what you want to do. You need to figure out what's the blueprint of your talk. And when you are trying to design your slides, when you are trying to design your presentations, what happens is that if you are just throwing so many things in there, you will lose track of the talk yourself. Your audience, the poor audience, will not even get a simple understanding of what you're talking about because you didn't even understand it because of all the material that you're trying to shove into the presentation. So in order to have a great planning about the presentation that you're going to have, so what are the things that we can do? There are 4 questions that I believe that you need to answer in order to have a really great planning for your talk. The first is that, how long you have got? So in case of 3-minute thesis presentation, you have 2 minutes and 50 seconds. That's the first trick. Never go for 3 minutes. All kinds of stuff can happen when you go up stage. You can get stressed out, you may black out, you may forget, all kinds of stuff can happen to you. So aim for 2 minutes and 50 seconds because you will have a 10-second spare time to gather yourself around, try to come back and continue your presentation. So this is one thing that I've seen many people don't do. And they try to be like 2 minutes and 59 seconds. Great, I'm below 3 minutes, so I'll be fine. It's not going to work out. You will definitely go over time, unless you're talking really fast like me. So make sure that you are not aiming for 3 minutes. That's one of the most important tricks that I can think about. The next question is that, so what's the story that you're going to tell? So it's of course your research, a 3-minute thesis. So when you want to talk about your research, you need to find out some details about how to make that story relevant to your audience. There are some questions that you need to figure out in your mind before coming up with the story that I'll get into some of their details at the end of the presentation. So we'll get back to it in detail. So another important question that you need to figure out and you need to know the answer is who you're talking to. Am I talking to my committee? Am I talking to my peers in my department? Am I talking about college-level educated people who attend the university and have no idea what I'm working on? They may be from another department. That is the true answer. So you are talking to people that are college-level educated and they know basic biology, they know basic literature, they know basic math, basic chemistry, basic physics, but that's it. They are not necessarily an expert in your field. So you need to know your audience and be able to relate to your audience and the level of knowledge that your audience has in that specific field of topic. And finally, it's really important that you know why you are talking to them. Of course, you want to impress them and win that People's Choice Award and the money. That's for sure. That's at the top of the list. But apart from that, another thing that you're doing is that you want to talk to them about your research. You want to let them know why your research is important. You want to let them know why you are spending all these years in graduate school trying to do what you love. What's their relevance? So that why, the answer to that why is something that makes the audience relate to what you're doing, and that's one of the other important factors. So I want to combine everything together, answering these 4 W questions. So you're doing, or if I'm the presenter, so I need a less than 3 minute. That's how long. Convincing story to tell my research. That's my story. For college level educated audience, and that's who I'm talking to show the importance of what I do. That's why. For living. If you can come up with a story with these features, you will be able to be among the top winners of your 3 minute or overall whoever you're presenting to. So you will bump up your presentation. Questions so far? Ideas, comments, questions, pushbacks? Awkward silence. Okay. So, as I mentioned, just to recap, so you will have less than 3 minutes. That's the answer to your how long. You will have your research to talk about. That's the answer to your what question. And then you know your audience, and at the end, the importance of what you do. So I cannot emphasize how important it is to be able to answer every single one of these questions. So now we know what we want to do. Now we know the story. Now we know the plan. Now we want to sit down and plan our presentation. So we need to do preparation. And in order to do the preparation for the presentation, of course, dress to impress. That's one of the things. But what do you think would be helpful for you when you are preparing for your presentation or doing any kind of presentation? Let's hear each other's ideas. For me, it's a cup of coffee, for example. That calms me down, gets me a little up to my speed, gather my thoughts. For some people are just reviewing the key points of their notes. I want to know what you think. It's supposed to be interactive.
I'm sorry, will you repeat the question?
So what do you think would be helpful for you when you are preparing for a presentation?
I have to exercise.
That's a good point. You'll do the exercise. What other things?
Breathing.
Okay, reading.
Breathing.
Breathing, yes, sorry. Breathing.
Don't stop breathing.
Well, reading helps too. What's that again? Xanax, you said?
Practice.
Practice, of course, the practice, and I'll get to that practice in detail. So, a couple of questions that helps you to do this planning or coming up with the blueprint of your presentation. First is that you need to know what do you have in common with your audience when you're trying to think about your presentation. For example, I'm a person dealing with health-related stuff. So if I want to talk to my audience and the topic is obesity, what I try to talk about is that, okay, more than 50% of adults in the United States are suffering from obesity, overweight, diabetes, all kinds of the diseases that the stats are out there. So I'll try to have a relevance with the audience. I'll try to have the attention of the audience because of the statistics that may get them involved. So that's one point. So I'll try to find a commonality between me and my audience. Maybe there's a 50% male audience, maybe there's a 50% female audience, and I want to talk about something related to males or something related to females. So I'll try to bring that up. I'll try to facilitate or utilize the presence of male and female in the audience and use that in order to make my point. There are so many other examples that you can think about. You can, for example, come and talk about the division between different ethnic races that are present in the room. You can talk about how many different cultures may be present in the room. You can talk about how many different languages are spoken among the audience that are present in the room. And you can use all of those as something to make commonality between your audience and they start to relate to somehow. The other point is that I mentioned that you need to come up with the story, and the story is your research. But as Dr. Grubbs mentioned in his slides, you can get personal a little bit too. You can come up with your own story. It doesn't have to be necessarily about your experiences, about what you experienced before, your emotions. It can be a story that you are telling. In my case, for example, I work on a disease that killed Albert Einstein, and it's some sort of a heart disease. But the story that I always try to use when I'm talking about my research is that I'll bring up the fact that Einstein, one of the giant physics minds in the world, died of the disease that I'm working on. And it happened many, many years ago, and still we don't have a cure for it. So that's how I try to come up with a story relevant to my research. If you can think about the kind of story that relates to your own research, that's something that will make your presentation set apart from the other presentations that are happening in the room. The other important question that you need to answer is that, okay, so you're doing a research, you're spending many years on your research, where it will take us. What's the importance of your research? There are so many different directions that a research can go. There are so many outcomes that you can have out of your research. So what's the most important one? What's the one that you can, make it big and talk about it and be proud of it? Try to use that one. You don't have to go to full details of your research. Try to talk about the ones that matter the most. The gist of your presentation would be the most important part of your research. And as I mentioned, the last question is that why it matters, why you are doing it. There is a need behind your research. What's that need and how you can make that need relevant to your audience again. So these are all questions that somehow relate to each other. And as I mentioned, the creativity is trying to find the common ground between all of these and try to use some relevant stories and big points of your research in order to facilitate it and narrow it down or distill it to a good portion of your research. So let's say that We sat down, we thought about the project or research. Now we know what we want to do. We have a plan for the research. So now it's time for practicing. So you want to start practicing, and practice is one of the most important things that comes up. So if you'll be able to practice your presentation a lot, you'll have a better understanding of what you're going to talk about. And just another tip that I want to give you out here is that do not practice in order to memorize your presentation. When you memorize your stuff and you lost track of one word in your talk, there is a chance that you will forget all of it. As I said, you go upstairs, you see the lights, the people, you black out, you can't talk. And that happened many times. So instead of practicing memorizing your talk, practice to learn your talk. Know what you're going to talk about. If I'm going to talk about my research, I will know it back and forth. In either wording, in either kind of sentence use, I will be able to talk about it. So it doesn't matter what phrases I memorize to use. Just I need to know what I'm going to talk about. Intro is about Einstein, for example. The middle is the finding of my research. And at the end, it's what matters. So these are the points that I practice and I know. And these are in my mind instead of the phrasings and wording in sentences. So, another important thing when you're doing the practice is that it's not usable if you just sit down and practice by yourself. You will not be able to figure out what are the problems, what are the shortcomings. So either practice with your significant other, practice with your parents, friends, whoever you can find, and try to get their feedback. Because I can't tell you how helpful it will be. If you're talking too fast, like the problem that I usually have when I start presenting, so you'll be able to understand that because the person that you're practicing in front of her or him will give you the point that, hey, you're going too fast. If redundant body movements, the person, the audience, the single audience will let you know of that. If you don't have anyone to practice in front of in the short time, so you can just record yourself, just use your mobile camera, stand in front of it, record yourself, and then go back and try to watch yourself. Again, I try to do it 10 times, maybe 20 times, until you get to a point that you feel confident that what you want to say and the way that you're saying it is completely enough for what you want to do or the goal that you want to achieve. So now you practice. You have the plan for your research. You know what you want to talk about. You practice. And now you want to do the execution. You want to go up stage and you want to do the performance. And 50% of what you're doing is that presentation, is that execution of presentation. You worked really hard. You think that you have the best story in the world, the best research, the most beautiful one. If you don't deliver your message in an impactful way, it's not going to be no good. So you need to make sure that you will have a public speaking communication skill that will facilitate the delivery of your research or the message that you want to give to your audience. So let's see what can be some of these tips about performing. The first thing that I can always think about is do not apologize. It will be in the fall. People may get flu, cold. You may have a sore throat. Do not start by apologizing for your bad voice. It just doesn't give out a good vibe. You're up there and you're delivering a 3-minute thesis presentation among all the other students throughout the campus. You don't have to apologize because you don't have a good voice. You're already up there. You're doing something great. So why apologizing? Just do not give out that weak feedback about yourself. That's the first point. The other point is that make sure that you're speaking loudly and clearly. If you are like me, English is your second language, there are so many times that you can mispronounce a word, the way that you're phrasing the ups and downs in your sentences. So many things can go wrong, especially when you're under pressure and you're under stress. So make sure that you will be able to speak loudly and clearly and make sure that you separate out the words in your sentence so people will be able to understand. And if you are a native English-speaking person, still you can talk fast and remember and have in your mind that there are so many people in your audience that English is not their first language. So if you are just trying to be speaking English with a southern accent, maybe I will not be able to understand it because the way that you're talking. So make sure that you try to have it clear and loud and as vivid as possible. I somehow mentioned the third point here is that making sure that you are using simple and short sentences without jargons, with minimal use of scientific jargon. And again, don't try to have that long sentence that tries to connect 4 different points together. Separate them and try to have great connections in between those sentences. So instead of having one long sentence with too many words in it, try to have transition words. Try to lead the way for your audience in order to understand what you're talking about. And the very last point that I want to mention is that do not be a flat tone. When you go to a presentation, one of the things that makes everyone fall asleep is that very low tone, flat. They're not using ups and downs and just trying to go over different points and different matters. So what's going to happen at the end is that half of the audience will fall asleep. Instead, if you try to use ups and downs, if you try to finish your scientific presentation in a strong way and be like, hey, this is the main point of my research. And this is what I think will bring good to the humanity because of the impact of my research. Ups and downs, questions ups and downs, important points strong, things like that will make a difference when you're making a scientific presentation rather than being shy and try to go slow and flat tone. That's not going to be really helpful for you. So the other point is that make sure that you are using the body language. Use these 2 hands. Do not fold them behind you. Do not try to hide your hands. The hands will help to facilitate a way of better understanding when you're delivering your message. And I'm one of those persons that use my hands a lot. But sometimes the other problem is that you may use them too much. So make sure that you are aware that whether you're using it too much or too less. Find that balance. Make sure that these hands are out there trying to show that how enthusiastic you are about the project that you're delivering to your audience. And of course you will be disqualified, but as a general point, never ever go over time. You can't imagine how it's going to look bad when you are sitting in front of a presenter and they are like 10 minutes over time and every other presenter is behind the time, want to make up the time that they lost because of overtiming of the previous presenter. So it's just a general rule that do not ever go over time. And at the end, maybe it will not be a really good point for the 3-minute thesis presentation, but in general, always finish with a summary. Make sure that you are bringing all the points that you discussed, like at the 5 minutes before, rather than just finishing up at the very last point. So make sure that you bring everything that you talked about all together, like a 2-second, 10-second summary of what you discussed about that point. Draw the conclusion with relevance between all those different steps or different points, and then finish, instead of just finishing your presentation without giving any sort of summary about the points that you discussed. And as these performance issues, I cannot emphasize how important is the eye contact. Many of the people who are presenting, they're always like this. They look at their slide, they look at their notes, they look at their laptop in front of them. But I cannot emphasize how important this eye contact is, because when you have this eye contact, and when you're talking with your audience, if you have eye contact, it makes you feel significant. When you are trying to talk with different people, it makes you feel that, you are the one that the presenter thinks that you're listening to. So this eye contact is very important about engaging your audience. And this is just one fancy animation. So far, I talked about how to plan and how to go over some of the planning questions that you need to have in your mind, and what would be helpful to you in order to have a good performance. So far, any questions, any comments, any dilemmas that you may have?
Can you see a timer when you're speaking, or do you just have to kind of know 1, 2 minutes?
I assume for the 3-minute there will be a timer.
Yeah.
I always ask, do not show me the timer. Because when you see the clock ticking, that will add the pressure and the stress. And if you are like 5 seconds behind of what you've practiced before, it's going to make you lose track of what you want to say. So my personal suggestion is that do not look at the time. or do not go after the time. Because by the amount of practice that you do, you should know where you are in timing when you are a specific sentence on a specific part of your presentation. And that 10-second delay that I mentioned, so not going for 3 minutes, going for 2:50 instead, will allow you that if you hit a little bit of trouble among the presentation, that 10 seconds will allow you to adjust a little bit. But if you want to keep track of the time, there will be, of course, a timer in front of you. Any other questions? Yes?
Something that I found challenging in some of my presentations is knowing exactly what is the appropriate amount of, what's the word I'm looking for, like specifics to get into with a lay audience. Sometimes I overestimate them and other times underestimate. And do you have any advice about that, or what's a good tool to use?
So in general, I think that in order to find that balance between the amount of scientific points that you want to bring up for your lay audience is that do not go more than 2 scientific points. So of course, for example, you have a discovery research disease that you're working on, and then you have your matter of your research, for example, your molecule of interest, your big word that you need to throw out there. So you need to describe the problem first, and then you need to describe your approach as well. So if you just keep the balance between like 2 scientific points, I personally believe that that would be really helpful for the people around you or in your audience to understand. And as I will get to it in a little bit, there's this saying out there that people or the audience in a short amount of time can only remember 3 different points. So one would be your introduction, or all the other stuff. One would be your problem, and one would be your solution. So personally, I think that that would be a perfect balance for finding that common ground with lay audience. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, if you could be a little more specific about like what you consider as a scientific point. So one thing that I'm like challenges in general is like just general vocabulary. Do I need to explain all of these things, or do I just touch on them and assume that my audience knows what is a gene or a phosphate? You know, how far in depth do I need to get into those explanations before I get boring or redundant or etc.?
So in my experience, you were talking to a college-level educated audience. So they have a basic understanding of some general biology, math, physics. But still, it would be really helpful if you're talking about the gene. So just give a 2-second introduction to gene, the backbone of what makes you, for example. So do not get into a lot of details about that very general word, but still like 1 or 2 words of introduction would be really helpful. And save the time or the bigger explanation for the actual big scientific point that you want to make, which is about your research. So I think that would be a good approach. Yes, please.
Well, what about the use of repetition throughout? Like, how much are you encouraged to repeat yourself or repeat certain points versus like moving on and making the connection? You know, how do you integrate that?
So it really depends. This is one of those specific questions that really depends on what you are presenting. So if what you're presenting requires you to repeat what you just said like 1 minute ago, it may be helpful to grasp the audience attention and make relevance to what you are discussing currently. But what I've experienced is that if you need to repeat yourself about one specific point, try to approach it a little differently or with a different flavor, different wording, different aspect of discussing that point that you're trying to repeat. If you're, for example, talking about a gene, instead of gene, try to come up with another explanation or something that can replace the word gene but still has the meaning and doesn't somehow dumbing down the point that you want to make. So, as I said, it's a little specific to the story of the research. And, you know, it will be your creativity how to adjust it and how to make sense out of it. Any other questions? All right, so we move on to the no-nos. We discussed what we should do when we are doing the presentation. So what are some of the no-nos? So these are most of the things that I've seen many of these presenters do, not necessarily 3-minute thesis ones, but you can definitely see that the resemblance in many of the participants as well. And this shows the stress. This gives out how stressed out you are. This gives out how under pressure you are. So it doesn't allow you to show how calm and confident you are. And the first thing is that playing with your clothing or your glasses. These are very simple points, but when you put all of them together and have a big picture look at them, it will somehow you get to a realization point that okay, these are the things that matter at the end of the day. So the first point is that playing with your clothing. Males wear jackets, or may have the microphone not adjusted very well. Make sure that everything is set up before you go to the podium and go up on the stage and delivering the presentation. Anything that you do extra on the stage will distract the audience, because one of the first things that audience want to do is what? Getting distracted. That's one of the rules. So one of the first things that audience wants always to do is that getting distracted. There are potential for getting there's this potential hazard of having your audience being distracted by anything. So do not give them anything to distract them. Of course, do not chew gum when you are doing the presentation. I've seen that a few times. You are mic'd on. So when you chew and you talk, people can actually hear the sound. Or when you are, eating a candy. This may sound a little naive, but people do this, especially some of the people, they are like, if I eat a little bit of sugar before my presentation, so it will help me to be more relaxed and have more energy, and they have the gum or candy in their mouth when they're doing the presentation, it just makes a nasty sound. So this is something that you need to be aware of. The other thing is that sometimes you don't have one of these wireless mics. So you are at the podium with the microphone in front of you, and I've seen a lot of people that put both of the hands on either side of the podium and be like this, trying to talk, and it just doesn't give out really good impression, because when you lean into the microphone and put your hands at the podium, you will limit yourself about the use of body language. So you will not have your hands to use for conveying the message. So that's another point that you need to have. And this is not the case for the actual 3-minute, but in general presentations or the showcase, you will have notes that you will have. So shuffling your notes without any need or going over them gives out how stressed out you are. And audience can really understand that if you're shuffling your notes randomly. So that's another thing that you need to keep in your mind. As I mentioned, you will be on the stage. Worship Theater is a great place if you haven't been there. Another tip that I can tell you is that make sure that you always check out when you're doing the presentation. And you will have a big stage, so you will be able to walk. And this walking, when you are talking, gives out how confident you are. So if instead of standing in a corner and trying to talk and bring up the points about your presentation, if you start to walk, if you start to show how confident and calm you are, and try to use the movements that you have. For example, in one of the presentations, I've seen a presenter talks about, okay, point A and point B, and when he's talking about point A, he's standing at point A, and then when he starts to talk about point B, he starts to walk and goes to point B. These are the things that can actually be really important and can help your presentation to stand out when you're delivering your talk. The other thing is that I've seen it a few times that was really interesting for me is that some of the presentation skills websites, online courses, or even workshops that you go to, they give you specific gestures that you need to do. For example, I talked about not standing without movement. So there's this saying in some of the workshops saying that, okay, come 3 steps forward when you're opening the talk, and then go 1 to the right, and then come back to the center and go 1 to the left. So these are obviously practice gestures that adds to that distraction of the audience that I mentioned earlier. And also, it's obvious. It's obvious that you practice. It's not natural. It doesn't give out how good you are at your presenting. You're just trying to keep your composure, your mind. You're like, okay, 1 step forward, 1 step to the right. You're not dancing on the stage. You're just trying to convey a good message. So make sure that you don't use those practice gestures. Another thing that I've also seen very popular among the presenters, not necessarily 3-minute thesis, is that people start to talk about their research and then they start to go like this. So they're like, hey, in my research, what I was doing was really important. I found about this drug that helped the humanity because it treated that disease. So it's not really welcoming. It's not open. Instead of crossing your arm and look like that really proud person who thinks that, he's the best researcher or best graduate student in the world, try to use open gestures, open hands, be welcoming. Open hands means being welcoming. And you've seen this probably a lot in the news when they're doing analysis of the gestures of politicians and presidents. So if your hands are open, it means that you're welcoming and gives out a really good impression about the way that you're talking. So do not cross your arms. That's the bottom point. And the last point that I have here is that, you will have a pointer in general presentation, but not necessarily. I don't think that you will have anything to touch for the 3-minute. But in general, you may have a pen, you may have a pointer, which is the most common one, and you've seen people that they go back and forth. They go back and forth and they lost track of what the slides they were talking about because they cannot use the pointer properly. So make sure that in general presentations that you're doing, you are just not touching the pointer unless you want to point out to something, unless you want to bring up this laser point or back and forth. Remove your finger from the pointer or do not play with that pen because as I mentioned again, it will gives out how stressed out you are. So these were some of the no-nos that I wanted to talk about when you're doing your presentation. Questions, comments? Yes?
How do you do open gestures when you're holding the microphone? Because then you're automatically...
Well, you have one, if this is, for example, a microphone, you still have one arm to use. And I'm not saying that you need to do that always, but, if you have a microphone, there is pros and cons. So you cannot cross your arms, but you cannot always use the hand. So you just need to find the balance over there. But still, you will have one hand to, lead the way, basically. And I assume that for the 3-minute, they will be wireless, every one of them. So you will have both hands to use. Yes?
This is a question about walking.
Mm-hmm.
When I have given a seminar presentations in the past for the department, I walked across the screen and I got a lot of feedback saying it was actually distracting. So do you typically go all the way across or only halfway, or have you ever gotten feedback that it's distracting, or do people typically appreciate that?
So in general, when you're teaching presentation and skills, there's 1 or 2 sessions about the body movement. And when you get into the details of those body movements, is that you need to find out the perfect time for moving. If you're in the middle of presenting about a scientific point with 2 graphs on your slide, and you are just walking, and the graph and the points that you are making are behind you, that will be definitely distracting. But when you are at the transition of your talk, you want to go from point A to point B. When you want to do the conclusion, when you are at the part of the talk that is not slide dependent or not really scientifically heavy, that's the part that you can start moving a little bit and walk around the stage. Personally, I don't really recommend walking throughout the whole stage because first, that's a long walk, and the second is that with increased movement or increased walking, you will have increased heart rate. You may get short breath because you were stressed out. So it will have some influence in your presentation if you do the long walks or long movement. But just a little bit, just to show that you are comfortable at this stage. That's the point. That's the key point. Any other questions? All right, so what I have here is that it's called 5 rules for having the best presentations in the world, or for creating world-changing presentations. And most of these slides are adopted from a company run by a lady called Nancy Duarte, and she's one of the pioneers and leaders in presentation skills and making great presentations. So these are the 5 rules that I personally always would like to follow when I want to do a presentation. It helps me to come up with a clear plan and have that different and memorable presentation well compared to the other presentations that are done in that specific time period. And the 5 rules are, if we want to get to the bottom of it, the first is that treat your audience as the king. They are the ones that give out the vote for you to win the People's Choice Award. They are the ones that their decision will give you the money. That being said, they are the ones that matter to you when you're doing the presentation. You are presenting for them. So they are the ones that will give you feedback, that will remember you at the end of the day. So that's one point. I'll try to get to some of the details of these. The second point is that make sure that you spread ideas and move people. I'll get to the details of any of these. And help them see what you are saying. So use great visual aids, facilitate the slide that you will have. I'll get to the details. And make sure that you're practicing design, not decoration. That's something that we always see with PowerPoints. And at the end, you need to have a healthy relationship. You need to cultivate that healthy relationship with your audience. As I mentioned, some of the way with eye contact, with engaging them and things like that. I'll try to get into the details of some of these. So the first point is that in order to treat your audience as the king, you don't need to have what's called a slide document, a combination of a slide and a document. So instead of having too many points on your slide, putting so many information in your slide, make sure that you will have one clear point. And always remember that when you're doing the presentation, it's not another meeting that you're going. It's about the meaning of the presentation that you're delivering. So it's really important to think about the meaning of what you're talking about. That's what will be remembered from your talk. So it's really important to practice a little bit of that design that I mentioned earlier and use that one single slide or how many slides that you will have for your regular presentation to deliver your message. And one simple rule is that make sure that you're thinking billboard. And this think billboard thing is really important when you're doing your 3-minute thesis. So when you're looking at a billboard, you're driving home, so you will have max like 3 seconds, maybe. If the location of the billboard is really good, you may be at the stoplight, so you will have more time. But the point is that big picture with visuals, really minimal text, still giving out a powerful message. So try to think billboard when you're doing your PowerPoint presentation for your talks or even 3 minutes. And as I somehow mentioned, so there's this general rule that people can only remember 3 points. And in terms of 3-minute thesis, 1 point would be the overall general introduction that you're talking about. And 1 point will be the problem that you're describing, and the other point will be the solution that you're offering. Anything extra that you try to add to this formula, you will increase the chance of people not remembering or not relating to what you're talking about. Another point that is really important, I like to call it reducing visual pollutions. In the next 2 slides, what you're going to see is that the slides that I was trying to make before, trying to learn a little bit of these tips and tricks. And for example, in this one, I think this is like from 7 or 8 years ago when I wanted to talk about causes of obesity. So you will have a blurry background here. There's this bullet point, which I personally are not a fan of. So bullet point is just another visual pollution because it doesn't really add anything. You can have the sentence separated by a space without having the bullet point. So I have a topic here, a blurry background, a bullet point with a sentence. I have multicolor boxes here with information in them. And there is this awkward box that is, there's like more bigger than the other one. So this is full of visual pollution. The other one is one of my classics and my favorites is that these are 2. So this slide was made about talking about the space nutrition and the space foods and how we need to address the nutritional requirements of astronauts basically. There's this flying tomato here. You will have 2 people in the background. There's this box here, different bullet points, different text, and then there's this reference here that doesn't really make sense. So this is a classic visually polluted slide. And I'm pretty sure that there will be details of how to have a better design in a Thursday workshop. So there will be more details, but I just wanted to have some sort of samples here. So now, if you want to reduce that pollution, okay. So you will have some sort of a joke here, having Darth Vader here, and then there is one point here, you are delivering your point about, okay, I'm talking about cancer, and cancer is Darth Vader. This was before the new Star Wars movies that some people started to fall for Darth Vader. And then you want to talk about gene or structure, so there's this DNA strand, it's a structural process, so you have a structure here, and minimal text, one image that will deliver out the point. So these are just some examples of visual pollutions. Before going to the final rule, do you have any comments or questions about design or visual pollutions? It doesn't really require you to master PowerPoint because you're not doing anything really crazy with your PowerPoint. You're just using good, high-quality images and proper use of texting. So it's not like that you are trying to design something that flies around and do wonderful things on the slide. So minimal use of Word and then high-quality, relevant pictures. So the last point after those 5 rules that I mentioned earlier is cultivate a healthy relationship with your audience. And one of the important ways of doing that is that, so I've seen many people when they're doing the presentation, either 3-minute or general presentation, they go on behind their slide, hide behind their slides. So they're just either looking at their slide and just standing like this all over the place, or either looking at the laptop in front of them. Instead of doing that, there's this saying that says, come out from behind of your slide and try to look at the audience, engage with the audience, and do not turn your back toward your audience when you're presenting. We've seen that a lot, maybe in departmental seminars. It sometimes happens because people are stressed out, students, or even in the teaching classrooms, people turn their back. I know that there are sometimes needs for using the board or write something. That's true. But in general, when you're talking, try not to be like this and always try to point out different things on your slide without having a grasp of attention from your audience. Best way to overcome that is, minimize the amount of texts or the amount of points that you want to talk about. So you don't have to read through them to remember them. Put them in a note if you need that. Have it in front of you, and when you're talking, just point out to them and have the attention of your audience as well. And then at the end, I can emphasize how important it is to practice in order to master these 5 rules that I mentioned. So I don't have anything else really to discuss. There's only 1 or 2 points that I want to discuss. But before that, any general comments, questions, dilemmas, things that you're not sure about that you want to talk about before getting to the end of the presentation?
So how do you time your 3-minute thesis? Like, how many seconds do you spend on introduction? And what do you do?
That's a very good question, actually. So it really depends on the topic. If you are throwing out a really complicated topic, it may take more. But in general, I think that you have 3 minutes, you have an intro, you have a main point, and you have the conclusion. 3 points, 3 minutes. So my personal rule of thumb is that I spend a minute for each one of those, give or take, because you're doing 2 minutes and 50. So I'll try to have a good introduction, because if you have a good introduction, then you have the attention of your audience. So introduction, I believe, is the most important part, because you're not presenting in front of your advisors or PhD committee. So the scientific portion does not have to be really detailed and robust, I'd say. It still needs to be accurate, true, with the main point, but it doesn't really have to do. That's the introduction part that grabs the attention of the audience and makes people interested in your presentation. So I'll do maybe 1 minute and 10 seconds for the intro, then I'll start bringing up my research, and at the end. Brenda.
In healthcare, especially, essentially every disease is the disease that will kill humanity.
Yes.
Whether it's cardiovascular disease, which is the number 1, cancer, which is the most adaptable, or antibiotic resistance, which is most projected. How do you then make it that, how do you differentiate your the killer from everybody else's the killer?
That's a good question as well. So first thing to remember is that We people that work in the health science know all the killers, not everybody else knows. So maybe for us, obesity is a well-known cause of death, but not necessarily to all people that are not really relevant to health. So still, it will be important to bring up, and it's your stage, your talk, you will have the killer disease. Doesn't really matter when you're it matters when you're presenting it in front of people or peers, but in general theme, not necessarily. And the other thing that helps is that make sure that you find some updated stats, relevance, something that relates. For example, if we're talking about these health-related killers, there has been a recent update about what's called the obesity state that, Center for Disease Prevention sends out every 5 years, I think, and they provide updated numbers of people who are suffering from obesity. And for example, Kentucky, which may be a relevant point, was the #1 state in the whole United States with less movements in the whole country. So we were the first for not having a lot of movements. So that's, for example, something that makes your audience relate to, because we are in Kentucky, and if you want to talk about something related, so try to come up with something that is updated a little bit, and your stage, your killer disease. Other questions? The last point that I want to mention is the WAS samples. This is the website from University of Queens in Australia where originally 3-minute thesis was started, and there is, I think, tens of presentations that you can find over there. And, these are winners throughout the world, so it's not necessarily from that university. You will find different universities talking about many different points, for example, Kentucky. So you will find many different presentations as samples that you can talk about, you can think about, you can get inspiration from, or you can even try to find some relevant topics to you and see how other peoples that won somewhere in the world try to use different terminology, different lay terminology in order to deliver their point. So this is really helpful to watch samples. There are many samples, and if you don't want to do this, you can always search. You open YouTube and search for 3-minute thesis in different universities, and almost all universities upload their 3-minute thesis, especially their winners, in their website. So, as I mentioned, always finish with a review. So, fight the panic with some of the early point that I mentioned. When you go to the podium, panic. When you get the podium, panic and go to the podium. Make sure that you're planning. Make sure that you know what you're talking about. Those 4 WH questions. So who, how long, what, why. Don't remember that. Make sure that you have answers to those. The no-nos of how to perform, what to do, what not to do. And at the end, the 5 rules that we discussed about how you can have that killer presentation. And I'd like to finish by saying that there was this famous guy once mentioned that if you can explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. So if you understand it well enough and you claim that you understand it well enough, you need to be able to explain it simply. And that's all for me. Keep in touch if you have any questions. I'd be happy to help you throughout the journey. And of course, I'd like to thank the Graduate School, Graduate Student Congress, and the Postdoc Society for giving me the opportunity to share my experience with you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Cheyenne. We do have one more 3MT finalist here with us who may or may not have, do you have some tips or some, especially speaking generally, but also to the humanities?
Yeah.
Hannah Rule, everyone. Hannah Rule.
I guess I can see. Are there any humanities people here? Oh, it's always 1 or 2 of us. We don't make up many. So it's hard for humanities to get ahead in the 3MT because if you can say I can cure cancer, people really like that. And humanities people say I do this really cool thing that makes you a better person, and that's really hard for people to like as much as curing cancer. So the only thing that I would repeat out of what Cheyenne has said is that practice a lot. A lot of the stuff that you're going to do, like walking across the stage, it doesn't matter as much as practicing, especially where you're going to be. It's really nice that they've done the scaffolding of this, because I thought after I did the first one, I was like, oh, I get it now. Like, and I felt like I did a pretty solid job, right? But I felt like I finally understood who my audience was and how to get to them, because it's what they want to hear about what you're saying, and not why you think it's important necessarily, but why you can make it important to them. And people don't care about humanities stuff because I can't say I'm curing cancer. And maybe that's what I should have gone with. Like, I studied Victorian literature. It cures cancer! But that's not at all what my research was about. So, just practice it a lot, and with people. Practice it with each other, especially if you're doing the scaffolding part where you don't have to worry about competing necessarily for the 3MT. The recording thing is also a really good idea. I'm happy to answer any questions about what my process was, or any questions that you guys have about 3MT. Not all at once, guys. I appreciate your time.
All right, well, it's right now at 7 o'clock. Do you have any questions about the process or anything that we didn't answer that may still be lingering? Yes.
During this, will you be introduced, or will you need to have an introduction included in your own?
You'll be introduced. So we'll have a slide that introduces you, just giving your name and your title. So you don't have to put your title on your own slide. It'll already be there on the previous slide. So we'll be talking some about the title on Thursday night, but just to remind you about that, I don't know, did we ask? We haven't asked for that yet, but we will be asking for a title in your slide, of course, in advance. But you'll need to translate your usual academic title. And I've seen most universities now, during their competition, will give the actual academic title and your translation shorter title, right? So we'll look at examples of titles, but your title needs to be really catchy, and you could talk more about this too, but something that's memorable, that is, depending on your topic, maybe humorous. A lot of ways of looking at a condensed 3MT title, and you can get plenty on the web also. But any other questions? Everyone going to do this?
They're in.
You're in? You're in?
Can I reiterate something? I really do mean do this more than once. Like, if you are a PhD student and this is not your final year in your PhD program, do it again next year, and then the next year, and then the next year. And the reason that I say that is because you are so crammed for time while you're trying to figure out how to do this thing, that you just end up putting together what you can when you can, right? Like, this isn't your main deal, right? This isn't your main shtick. So do it again.
Very good. How many of you are returning Thursday night to the next workshop? Most of you? Good. Bring others with you. Okay. And I'm serious. I know that in a way you don't want a lot of people in this competition, but it'll make the blood flow a little more, right? You'll get more competition going. Bring more people into this. And we'd love to have people from other disciplines that haven't been represented in the past. Like the humanities, I mean, very, very few humanities folks have competed, and so maybe Valerie will this time. Right. Thank you all. Hope you got a lot out of this. And if you do have questions, be sure and email one of us, and we'll answer you. Good luck to you all.